just worship.
I am excited.
The church should not look like the world.
The worship was just buzzing. It's a thrill to be part of.
When you can see justice in our world, this is the reign of God.
Mind-blowing.
The idea for the Just Worship Conference started about a year and a half ago. People often think that justice and worship are two completely different parts of the church's life. But what we're really trying to say here is that justice and worship are not two different things, but two parts of one whole.
Hi, Mark. I'm Antonia Coleman.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice
Let me
to
find
meet
your
you
name
too.
tag.
Thank you so
There
much.
you are.
Monica Hall, Hall.
Okay.
Hi, how are y'all? Good, I'm Mark. Andrew.
At first I didn't understand. I thought it was just worship, like the word just, but I started reading, and just was about justice in worship.
I am all about justice, and I am equally all about worship. So that's what brings me down here.
I'm excited about all of the events. The fact that we get to worship together, but then we also have these different workshops that speak to the different areas of interest that we have.
Justice is something needed now, I think, in our worship services. This is a primary reason that I came to the conference.
There is so much coming up that I want to tell you about, but I'm going to let you just glory in it yourselves and welcome you heartily, warmly, deeply to Just Worship.
The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes.
Sometimes the greatest way of saying something is to say nothing at all. Born in 1948 in Jemison, Alabama, Ruby Sales is an African-American activist. She came of age in the 1960s during the height of the civil rights movement. In 1965, she was arrested with fellow activists in Lowndes County, notorious Lowndes County, Alabama, where they were picketing a whites-only store. They were arrested, no surprise, and jailed for 6 days, no surprise. After being released, Sales and a few others went to purchase sodas at a nearby store. She was threatened by a deputy police officer who pointed a shotgun right at her. One of her colleagues was Jonathan Daniels, a white man, a 1961 graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, top of his class. He was preparing for ministry at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, Mass. When Daniels saw the shotgun, he pushed Ruby out of the way and took the shot that was meant for her. He died on the spot. Sales, for her part, was so traumatized by the whole scene that she nearly lost the ability to speak. For the next 7 months, she struggled to speak. Despite death threats made to her and her family, Sales did manage and muster the nerve to testify against Daniel's murderer. But the jury was made up of cronies, 12 white men who acquitted Daniel's killer. I watched a fairly recent interview in which Ruby Sales reflected on that event of 54 years ago. In the interview, she became the embodiment of Buechner's statement, "Life itself is grace." And she noted that her friend's sacrificial act revealed the depth of his character and commitment without the utterance of a single word. Maybe the greatest way of saying something is to say nothing at all. But we've also seen the power of language to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. We have seen the power of language to help one another share food with the hungry and provide the poor with shelter. We have used the power of language to instruct and motivate individuals to clothe those who are naked. We have used our language to be supportive of our kin, our sisters and brothers. Perhaps the greatest way any of us can know what to say and when to say it is just to shut up and listen.
Heading downtown to the pink granite capital in Austin, Texas, and we're going to have a sing in the rotunda. And if you've never sang in the rotunda, it's one of the most amazing acoustics ever.
I am excited because it's about protest music, and I'm a protest girl, so let's get it going.
The benefits of singing in a place like a rotunda is that it's almost like it was built for singing. And it's strange because this is the Texas state capitol, and that's not where singing happens, and yet we do it in this space.
This moment is a self-care moment for me, to be strengthened by other people who sing.
Something about voice, when it's just voice and it's in community, it tends to be something that's very powerful.
When we are proclaiming the coming reign of God, when we are praying for the needs of the world, in that moment, where we are acting out the justice of God. And I can't help but think that that keeps going out in circles after circles after circles.
And that, for me, is a just worship.
God of abundance, we come to you knowing we are not whole. Lord, have mercy. We have taken too much leaving nothing to spare. We have kept for ourselves what is meant for others.
Lord, have mercy.
We profit off those who are hurting.
Lord, have mercy.
We hold grudges, creating stumbling blocks to love our neighbors.
Lord, have mercy.
Forgive us, for you are the Lord our God.
Amen.
A man born only 2 years after me, a father, a grandfather, a horticulturalist, a peacemaker, a man unemployed selling cigarettes on the side of the road. And yes, this was illegal activity, but it was not violent activity. And this man, this black man, this mother's child who would have been 49 years old only last month, died on camera, face down on the stifling asphalt of a New York City street, crying out with his last breath, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." As we enter the second chapter of the letter of James, it is election season in the area among Roman Palestine. Eager young men of the upper class campaign in their best, whitest togas. Wearing the rings appropriate to their ranks, they go from one guild meeting to another, trying to persuade the rank and file to support them. James takes this season as the opportunity to tell a hypothetical story, a story about discrimination within the body of Christ, discrimination actively and unapologetically practiced by Christians. Suppose, says James, you were to be gathered at worship, and suppose into your worship walked one of these eager young men wearing the whitest toga and the big gold ring. And at the very same time, suppose a smelly, destitute person also walked in. And suppose, just suppose, you treated that gold-ringed, white-toga, eager young man with deference and hospitality, ushering him to a seat toward the center, away from the pillars, so he can see and hear. Meanwhile, the smelly, destitute person, suppose you placed him in the narthex to stand up, or perhaps under the pew. The story is hyperbolic in the extreme. So hyperbolic that it perhaps evokes some chuckles of embarrassment and self-recognition among the listeners. And we think we recognize this story also, don't we? The black woman with short hair who cannot easily be distinguished when driving as female, who gets profiled on her way to church while passed by white women going 10 miles per hour faster than the speed limit, right? The Indian man with a PhD from UCLA who works interminably for the right to work in the United States while white Russians come over in droves to birth their children. White young men with automatic weapons who have committed mass murder taken into custody unharmed, while non-violent brown or black-skinned offenders end up dead. Panting out their final words under a New York sky, "I can't breathe." This is just the news. We know this story. James's burden is this: the church should not look like the world. Even if discrimination is the natural course of things in the world, the church should not look like the world. Even if ignoring the needs of others is the natural order of things in the world, the church should not look like the world. Even if flaunting one law and then bragging that I uphold all the others is the natural order of things in the world, the church should not look like the world. For the moment the church begins to resemble the world out of which it is called, rather than the God who called it forth, the church starts gasping for breath. The moment the church succumbs to the neglect and inconsideration of the world, rather than seeing each person as God-birthed, Christ-saved, Spirit-inspired miracle, the church starts losing its voice. The moment the church starts justifying any violation of the command to love its neighbor, the church is lying on the ground in a chokehold, panting out with its dying breath, I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
The Just Worship Conference is extraordinarily important because people can think about Sunday morning worship as an escape from the world and a time for personal prayer, and not understand that instead Sunday morning worship is about God's entire just mission for the whole world. As we're preparing worship with worship teams in our congregations, are we going about it with a process of a gotta oughta, or that justice is first to us a gift? So I'm going to borrow from homiletics for a while. I use that finger pointing. We talk about this in sermon classes. If your sermon seems to be exuding you gotta, you should, you must, you ought, that's not quite getting at the grace and mercy and gift that God gives us first. So we talk about that in sermons. Do we have a statement and language about God's action, present tense, toward us, on our behalf, for the life of the world? So as we're preparing and thinking about how our worship assemblies are just, can we dwell that God's justice is a gift from the moment of creation and is in play until all is fulfilled, and then receive that gift and shape things so that others can receive that gift?
There's a term that we use, or that a lot of churches use, called blended worship. Blended worship and convergence are not the same. Blended worship says we need an opening hymn, okay? Hymn number whatever, okay? And in the next slot, we need a praise song. So we'll pick a praise song. But the content of the two may agree or may be able to dialogue, or they may not. The goal of blended worship is to fill a slot. The goal of convergence is that the content, regardless of the style, creates a golden thread throughout the worship experience. That's what convergence is. And it happens not only in the music, but in the preaching, the praying, the reading of the scriptures. Okay? So convergence is this coming together of the old and bringing it into conversation with the new.
The way he talked about just worship is having the content be what matters. I think more than anything, that is a great way to approach this issue of the church maybe dying, that it's not dying if we really focus in on what matters.
This project is called Undocumented Stories. We were collected stories from immigrants. We collected them at immigration clinics when they were wanting to know if they had rights. Most of them, they don't speak English, so they hand wrote these stories in Spanish, and we translated them to English as well. We want people to know the real stories. This is somebody's struggle. And as Christians, we should be with the oppressed. Like Christ, we should be with the marginalized, with the needy, with the oppressed, with those who suffer.
Right now, we're doing our final rehearsal before the cantata. And this is really the first time all of the musicians and all of the speaking parts and all of the choir have all been together in the same room since we've gotten here. So tonight, it'll be beautiful. It's so powerful. The words and the message of it is so powerful.
This is a cantata that Edith Alomar and Jorge Lockwood wrote, and she wrote it out of a response to being at the border. She was like, what can we do? And he said, you can write an opera, and so she did. She wrote this cantata, and it invites us to see their humanity, to see their plight, to see that these are the people that Christ called us to care for, and our worship should be focused on justice for these people. It's a really beautiful cantata, and it's profound to be a part of.
We've covered a lot of ground in these last just 2 days. We have sung and prayed, listened to the biblical story, listened to one another's stories. On Monday, we began hearing about just worship. We sang and prayed from creation to new creation, and along the way, we were led into the mystery of the silence of God and exhorted to shut up and listen. yesterday. We considered just worship, how worship is in and of itself part of God's justice making in the world. Today, we are here to respond to the call to just worship. Simple, right? Sometimes it's best not to overthink things, right? Well, I don't have to tell you, there's an awful lot to think about. I now live on the eastern shore of Maryland, a little spot of paradise. But I'm fortunate to continue to visit Atlanta several times a year, especially because I have a son and a daughter and 2 grandchildren there. On one of those visits, I woke up in their guest room one morning before anyone else was awake, so I lay quietly until I heard signs of life. The first sounds I heard were of 3-year-old Harper singing in her crib. I listened carefully through the wall and realized she was singing, Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me, which was the song that I sang to her father every night at bedtime, and this song that he now sings to her. My heart was just bursting. Then I heard her sing another song, and I couldn't quite place it at first. It turned out to be her rendition of a Louis Armstrong classic. I see skies of blue, clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. It was not long after that lovely awakening that I heard quite a different sound. News of yet another mass shooting. Not again, I thought, not so many. The sweetness of the morning was gone. A few hours later, my son and I picked up Harper from preschool, and as we drove home, she pointed out the window and exclaimed, "Look, skies of blue, clouds of white." She looked at me across the back seat and grinned and pointed outside and said, "What a wonderful world." And then my heart broke all over again, as I delighted in her and also thought of how one day she would find out that the world is not all that wonderful. She will learn that the world is full of hate and suffering and violence, and that life is sometimes a matter of unspeakable pain. I do not want her to go through active shooter drills at her school. I don't want her to know that children can be separated from their parents at the border, that families are torn apart by deportations, that refugees from a hurricane disaster can be turned away for lack of visas. I don't want her knowing a world where her friends and her relatives, whose skin is darker than her own, are treated differently than she, sometimes with devastating consequences. I do not want her to know that because of the generations before her, the planet she calls home is in peril, that teenagers from every part of the world, some only a decade older than she, are having to stand up and call the leaders of the world to account. And yet she will know. She must know. In the face of so much injustice and suffering, it is hard to keep despair at bay. It is hard to not be ruled by rage. It is hard to hold on to hope. No wonder we need to lament. And thanks be to God, the Psalms give us a way to do that.
Will you quiet
The psalmist's words become our own. How long, O Lord, will your people continue to suffer? How do we hold on to hope? My friends, we do it by worshiping. For God's sake, for our sakes, and for the sake of the world. Now, more than ever, we must devote ourselves, body, mind, and soul, to praying, to singing, to preaching, baptizing, and communing while watching, waiting, and working for the coming reign of God. We gather around Christ's own table, share in his own body, that we might be strengthened in hope, that we might enact that hope, that we might be that hope for the world. We pray through our songs, our dances, our words, our paint, our groans, our tears, our silences. We do all of this in worship because all of these things are not just preparation for the living of the Christian life. Our worship, as well as our work, is our participation in the work that God is already doing in the world. Our worship is not just our preparation. Our worship is our participation in what God is doing in the world.
This was much more than I expected, and I'm glad for that. What I'm taking home is going to be lived out in the body of the church.
When the focus is on salvation for all, that God is with every single person and wants us to see every person, that's just worship. And it's an incredible thing to witness when it's done. And I got to see that this week.
There's so much stuff that I want to take back home. I'm grateful for each and every aspect of this conference.
I hope that people who have been to this conference will do a few things when they go back home. I hope they'll either begin to or continue to deepen their sacramental life. I hope too that they'll start to understand that what they're doing in worship is a proclamation of, an enactment of, and an anticipation of the coming reign of God. I'm really grateful for the number of people from a variety of places, a variety of cultures, who drew on a deep well of faith and hope and commitment and passion to bring all of their best gifts so that we do this work together. So grateful.